dive into the green. First, I'll apologise. I have got a cold, so I'll be coughing now at you. It's only moved from here to there, so you must excuse the coughing. Um, there are many people out there who don't particularly like the colour green, particularly as clothing. There is at least one of them in this room right now, who have this idea that green clothing is somehow unlucky. Signe Chanel, one of the House of Chanel, said that the seamstresses don't like green. They don't like working with it. It's supposed to be unlucky. And there's a couple of places that comes from. One of them is probably the fairies. It's also probably got a lot to do with the idea that at one point working with green fabric was actually a really bad idea for your health. You don't want to be the person working on the green. That is unlucky for you, or wearing it, because it will have effects. So arsenic goes back a very long way. Mineral forms of it are found way back in the 4th century BC, and it's various forms. They know it's poisonous quite early on, and forms of it are used as poison in classical. Albertus Magnus is the first person to kind of say, yeah, this is an element rather than just a random substance. This is I can take the rock and get pure arsenic from it. It's about 1250. You don't get it written down as to exactly how that's done. How do we make pure arsenic, metallic arsenic, until Paracelsus? That's mid 16th century. And around the same time, he and other alchemists basically work out how to make what's called white arsenic, or arsenic trioxide, and that's the one that is generally used to poison people with, because it is easy to get hold of, it is tasteless, it is odorless. If the mixture is warm, it has no texture really. Put it in cold food, it's slightly gritty. You put it in something hot, and the symptoms of it are all extremely easily attributable to other things you might suffer from in the era. So yeah, arsenic poisoning. I have this pet theory that arsenic poisoning is a lot more common throughout the early modern period than has ever been recognised, based on the examples that do survive tend to be only discovered years later when somebody cracks. Of course, it's also throughout all the period used in a lot of medicine, because anything that's used to kill you can probably also be used to do you good in tinier doses. At least they would think that way. Arsenic is implicated in the deaths of definitely Charles Dickens and quite probably Jane Austen, to give you a sense of that. We're going to be sitting in the 19th century primarily, but first to kind of okay, yeah, well, that way around. So the important step comes in the work of Carl Wilhelm Scheele, who is a Swedish German, late 18th century, he's an important chemist, identifies several elements, a whole range of acids and a few others, chlorine gas notably. He works out how to separate and identify chlorine gas. He discovers oxygen independently from the work that Priestley was doing, and he's the one that generally gets credit for that. He calls it fire air. And like most chemists of the time, he would regularly taste his research, and it is thought that at some point that's what killed him. He was 43 and had, tried his own work a little too often. Among the various things he came up with, some of them turned out to be colours. So he creates a very bright yellow in the first instance from chlorine and oxygen, which looks like that. And that's him there. Don't know what he's got in his hand, but yes, he discovers this particular chemical. A British manufacturer nicked the patent off him, and it then became, and they named it Turner's Yellow, because Turner was using it in his artwork. So this really annoyed him, and he wanted to make another colour, and he wanted to name this one after himself, which he did. And that gave us, he was looking at arsenic a lot, and in 1775, he produced that colour. I mean, if you look at different versions of it, it's slightly different every time, but that's the one that gives you a sense of it. It's really quite bright, but it's also sort of mid-tone and slightly yellow. Um, Not a particularly flattering, pretty colour, I would say, but there we go. I've just bombarded your screen with the colour known as Scheele's green. So it is copper arsenite, or a range of similar copper diarsenite, copper meta-arsenite, or give roughly the same thing. It's not ideal for painting with. It's well, it's better in painting than it is in clothes because it stays as a powder, and this is part of the problem. It isn't a proper dye. It just sits on the fabric. It does go black in the presence of too much sulfur, and there's a lot of sulfur in the air on the streets, so that's a bit of an issue. But it is a very good paint color, and even though it's actually little tiny bits of dust not properly dyed in, it's a color that's quite hard to achieve by other means. And late 18th century, a lot of people are moving into cities, and then and for the next sort of 100 years or so, you have a lot of people who are used to having a lot of green around them. One of the theories is that they move into urban spaces and there's not enough green in their lives anymore. They're inventing a pastoral idyll, and if you can't have real flowers, then what you want is flowers on your wallpaper. You want artificial flowers with green leaves. You want green in other places in your life, and along comes this perfect color to do it. So Scheele's green is immediately sought after for clothing, wallpaper, flowers, candles, playing cards, sweets, blancmange. 2 years after it was made, Scheele wrote to a friend saying, "I'm worried that it might be poisonous." 2 years after. Manufacturers were not listening. This was so popular, this new thing. So yeah, a couple of things that I mentioned there. It's used in candles. Weirdly, using candles, it comes up in sort of 1830s. Somebody notices pretty quickly that this is actually a bad idea because it makes the candle burn brighter, but what you're doing is literally putting tiny, tiny particles of arsenic, spreading them into the air. There is a big scandal in terms of the making of sweets. So, but that's not the green. That's just other uses of arsenic. But the fact is, arsenic is all over the place. In 1838, there is an unfortunate incident where somebody is wanting to adulterate their sweet mixture with one substance, ends up accidentally buying a different substance because the apprentice chemist is looking around in the dark and picks up the wrong bottle. And the person who makes them falls ill but doesn't know why, so he thinks he'll just sell them at a discount because they don't seem quite right. So there's all these discount humbugs on the streets. 21 people died, about 200 were ill. It's lucky it wasn't far higher death count. And yeah, that just shows how easy it is to pick up arsenic around the place. There's other similar ones. In 1840, a family of 6 all die because a arsenic bottle had been spilled. They'd keep it as rat poison. The man of the house said, "Oh, that's all spilled. I'll put it in this old flour bag." And then at some point, somebody else picked up the flour bag and took it to the pantry because clearly it was a flour bag. And then a third person who didn't know where it had come from used the flour, which, yeah, not good. There's even there's a spate of poisonings of babies in Essex in the 1870s because someone has accidentally put arsenic in the talcum powder. It's just a fine white powder. It can get anywhere. But back to the green. Now there are. Yeah, I love this one. Look at this one first. So yeah, dresses are one of the things these are being used for, and this is an example. This is only 3 years after the colour is invented. This is clearly done using that colour. It's rather beautiful if you like that kind of thing, but it is very, very green and very, very not good for you. In 1814, it's joined by Paris green. And from a social history perspective, we can largely treat the two as the same thing. That's Paris green, as you see, a little bit bluer than the other one. Now this is made by Wilhelm Sattler and Friedrich Russ in Germany for the Wilhelm Dye and White Lead Company. And they're specifically making it as an alternative to Shields green, but not because Shields green is poisonous, because Shields green tends to darken in the presence of sulfur. So they're trying to have a version that doesn't do that, or at least doesn't do it as quickly. It can be used for painting. There are art historians who have suggested this colour have something to do with Cézanne's diabetes and Monet going blind. It's also made from copper and arsenic. It's just got extra acetone in. It's copper acetoarsenite. It is also known as emerald green, Vienna green, Schweinfurt green, after the town it was patented. It's not actually called Paris green until 1867, and that's because in 1867 it is also being used as an insecticide. Now, you might think that if something's being used as an insecticide, you shouldn't also be wearing it, but there you go. And by that date, it is being used as rat poison in the Parisian sewers. And that is what it is named after. But we'll call it that, because if you call it emerald green, it can get confused with something else. Somebody did a count of how many names Shields and Paris green get given over time, and there are sort of 86 different names, possibly because people don't want, are vaguely aware there's this color that's a bit dodgy, but if the color is called something different, it's clearly not the same chemical, right? So this must be fine for me, which is a bit bad. There you go. But yeah, throughout the 19th century, all wealthy women want a bright green dress. And these get dyed and then dusted over afterwards to get them extra shiny. So not only is the dye not a proper dye, it hasn't really gone in, there's extra dust all over it as well. The same is true of all the hair ornaments that are done in green. Oddly, we know more about the production of the latter, but you can kind of take them together, really. Artificial flowers and hair ornaments are done as piecework for the most part. There are many thousands of women and children and some men working in the industry, some in factories, but a lot of them doing piecework at home. And we have some good descriptions of what it was like in those particular establishments. In 1859, Dr. Ange Gabriel Maxime Vernois, pleased with myself for that, reported on the conditions in a small factory. So it noted there was little light and the workforce were covered in green dust. That there was green dust under their fingernails, in the creases of their elbows, and so on. A lot of them had sores, and the most vulnerable, the ones who were really getting hammered by this stuff, there was a group of men who took cloth that was already pre-dyed in picric acid, and then they would take this Paris green paint and they would brush it on with their arms, with their forearms, like that. And this is supposed to make a more natural shade of green. So they're using their bare arms and they're stretching this out to dry on wooden frames pierced by nails. So not only are they doing it on their arms, they're also getting scratches on their arms from the nails and then going back to rub some more green in there. You can't imagine a worse way of doing it, really, short of drinking the stuff. So yeah, their arms and their hands end up covered in arsenic. Vernois also notes that men of a sensitive disposition, look away now, they get this all over their arms and their hands, and then they go to the loo. And they end up with another regionally focused area of sores and bad news. People sometimes thought that they had syphilis because of this. Poor chaps. He also noted that unlike every other workshop he'd ever visited, none of these had any mice, rats, or even cats, apart from he found one cat and it looked ill, because all that dust in the air. One study a little later said that there was a factory that employed 100 girls, 26%, 26 of them presented symptoms of chronic poisoning. One died while they were doing the count, and only 4 appeared to be symptom-free. This is a slightly later picture of the making of artificial flowers, but it gives you some idea of how young, if you were doing it as a family industry, that you would be making these flowers even, as soon as you were able to physically do it. And of course, even if you are going out to work, you carry it home to your children. And it's, yes, when you're working from home, the stuff is absolutely everywhere. It's amazing how long it takes for anyone to stop all of this. Well, in Britain, anyhow. In France and in Germany, they quickly passed legislation against using them, at least as pigments for flower ornaments, because that was dust everywhere. British government did absolutely nothing. No comment. In 1860, the British Dr. Arthur Hill Hassell said that the condition of the flower workers was wretched in the extreme. France was still using it, but they couldn't use it for flowers, so they still used it in a lot of marketing and packaging. Apparently, retailers had a lot of green band boxes and hat boxes and things like that. So you still got it on you. And you end up with a flurry of things happening in the 1860s, when in Britain it finally reaches the point of, you have to take notice. Again, close your eyes for the of a sensitive disposition, because that is the sort of thing you're going to end up with. Yeah, nothing good to say about that, really. 19-year-old flower maker Matilda Shearer in London died in 1861, and her job had been dusting extra green powder over things, which was called fluffing them. Make them extra pretty, fluffing them. And the autopsy, again, gory details, said that the colour had reached her liver and stomach. Her fingernails were green, the whites of her eyes were green. She was seeing everything with a green tint to it. She's just full of arsenic. Punch 2 weeks later said it was proved by medical testimony that she had been ill from the same cause 4 times within the last 18 months. Under such circumstances of these, death is evidently about as accidental as it is when resulting from a railway collision occasioned by arrangements known to be faulty. The company know that this is hurting people. And yeah, a lot of things happen in 61 to 62, and I'm not entirely sure of the order of all of them, but it's certainly the case that the women wearing these dresses are starting to report that it is giving them skin irritations around their neck and so on. Here's another couple of examples of those beautiful dresses to die for. Yeah, I suspect that one's Shields and that one's Paris from the colour, but I'm not sure. And that's a lot of fabric. Where's it gone? Some of these dresses, if they're really, really green, bearing in mind that arsenic is a metal, so it actually weighs the fabric down a bit. Some of these, half of the weight of them is arsenic. Or it is arsenic, aceto, copper, acetoarsenide. So if you have a gown made from 20 yards of fabric, which something like that may well be, that has 900 grains of arsenic, which was the measure for chemicals of the time. And it was reckoned that from a dress of that kind, about 60 grains of the 900 would powder off in the course of a single evening. As you danced around, you would give off 60 grains. The average person can be killed by 4 or 5 grains. So a ball gown like that one might have contained enough arsenic to kill nearly 200 people. And that's where it becomes just unbelievable, isn't it? Staggering. 200 people's worth of arsenic in one dress.
Save the last dance for me.
Well, indeed, yes. Also, shoes. You find bit of Paris green shoe, and it's that little bit on the bluer side. And indeed, thinking of dancing, this was in Punch again, 2 skeletons. And given it says the arsenic waltz, we can take it to mean dedicated to the green wreath and dressmongers. So they are calling the headdresses and so on wreaths. And that picture was quite widely circulated at the time. An article in Punch also suggested that a man would have to be as green as the dress of his partner if he was willing to dance with a lady in a dress like that. It's not a smart thing for you to do, young men, and that these dresses should have labels on them marking them dangerous and poison, because other sorts of poison have to have a skull and crossbones on them, so the dress should have to have a skull and crossbones on it as well. About the same time, so 1862, a whole load of ballerinas performed Ondine in Hamburg in bright green dresses, and of course they're wearing them night after night and sweating a lot. About half of them fell ill at the same time. I've not been able to find out any more about that story, but yeah, that's the thing. At the same date, there's an orphanage in Boston where all the small children are getting sick. It turned out that the nurses' uniforms, which were blue, were dyed partly with arsenic and partly with a bluer colour to get a very rich colour. And of course, they were cradling the sick babies and making them ill. So at this point, of all the people to get involved, the Women's Sanitary Association decide that this is their business, and this is your kind of upper middle class do-gooders who, probably do some harm, but also quite a lot of good in going into the garrets and telling people that they should live better lives, certainly well-meaning. Miss Nicholson had visited the garrets where these flowers are made and had published another sort of shocking first-hand account of these half-clad and half-starved little girls with damaged their hands, who would turn these leaves into bouquets. And she said that one of the girls had refused to work anymore because of it, which, eminently sensible if you ask me. She said that some of them had been. So this girl spoke to Nicholson and said, I've seen my fellow workers working with bloodied, sore hands, and that she herself had kept on working till her face was a mass of sores and she was almost blind, at which point she said, no, I'm not going to do that anymore. That there are a lot of other terrible jobs out there, but probably not worse than this one. And this being published by the Ladies Sanitary Association alerts a lot of readers of the kind who would wear the dresses to the idea that, it's kind of like when everyone discovers that their trainers are made in sweatshops. Some people decide to care and others don't, but at least they should know. And most of the readers had just thought, she said, I think they imagined that the arsenic gives them a dreadful cold. No, it's not just a cold. And on the back of that, Hoffman, who is an analytical chemist, is actually hired by the Ladies Sanitary Association to find out how bad this is and to test the leaves from a headdress and move on from there. And that's where we get those statistics about how much arsenic is actually in things. Because yes, so this isn't government again, this is the Ladies Sanitary Association deciding it's their business to sort this out. The British Medical Journal said that that a woman who wears these arsenic green fashions, bearing in mind for the following statement that somebody being killing was a term for them being attractive. So, oh, they're stunning, they're killing, yeah. Said, well, may a fascinating wearer of it be called a killing creature. She actually carries in her skirts poison enough to slay the whole of the admirers she may meet within half a dozen ballrooms. But yes, lovely pun there on killing, really. The Times contribution to this debate is, what manufactured article in these days of high pressure civilization can possibly be trusted if even socks may be dangerous? Because someone had done a test and found arsenic in socks. There's a weird side benefit to carrying around smelling salts at this era. Obviously, a lot of ladies are carrying around a little bottle of smelling salts in case they faint because they get too hot, not generally because of their corsetry, one should add. Yes, Dr. Letherby suggests to the Times in 1862, if you want to avoid taking these arsenic green home, how can you tell that that's what you've got? So there are some other options these days which might also give a similar shade of green, but ammonia turns blue or violet in the presence of copper. So all you have to do, Dr. Letherby said, if every lady would carry with her when she is shopping a small phial of liquid ammonia, suspicious green would betray the arsenical poison and settle the business immediately. So all you have to do is find a discreet little corner of the dress and waft your smelling salts over it, and it will change colour. And that way you know that you're dealing with arsenic. And the more it changes colour, the more arsenic you've got, the more you might want to not take that home with you. Because there were alternatives, or at least just around the corner there are. So by the time this 1861, 1862 panic comes up, there are alternatives. For a while, there weren't any that gave anything like that degree of vividness. Traditionally, bright green, is surprisingly hard to achieve. People who don't know anything about dye think, oh, well, it's easy because, it's the colour that's out there everywhere, but chlorophyll isn't a dye. For hundreds of years, the only way you could get any sort of bright green was by doing something bright yellow and then over-dyeing in woad, in blue. And the effect just isn't the same, so you don't get green really in historic pieces. Weirdly, there is a Chinese option that comes in 1842. The Chinese lost Hong Kong to Britain, and the French, of all people, then thought, oh, now it's British, we can go there and find out a bit about how the Chinese did things. So we can ask around in Hong Kong. And they brought back these little green sort of like makeup cakes or mud cakes, patties. And it's called lo cow, and it's made from the bark of the buckthorn. We had been using the leaves of the buckthorn for centuries. For some reason, nobody had ever thought to try the bark. But our variety of bark gives a mustardy sort of colour, so there's not much point because lots of other things give that. The eastern variety of buckthorn gives a lovely green, but it's not light fast. So it's popular for a while, but wouldn't you rather have that arsenic that will survive being in the sunlight? Then there is another option that actually goes back as far as 1840, but for some reason nobody uses it so much. In 1863, Empress Eugenie, who is terribly fashionable, wears a green silk made from a new non-toxic dye. It's called an emerald silk, and it comes from, it's a little bit more turquoise. It is called Viridian. So first we have, that's the colour you get from the low cow, as it says there. Which again, pretty good, but it's not light fast. It's not quite survived the passage of time, because that's pieces of actual fabric stuck into the book there. And then the next contender is Viridian, which is that colour. Again, slightly different shade, more towards the turquoise. And yes, viridian comes from the Latin viridis, that it's sort of green and blooming and fresh. And this is hydrogenated chromium oxide. It was actually invented in 1868, but the Parisian colour maker Panetier, who made it, kept the process secret. You could buy some of it in the Winsor and Newton catalogue in 1840. Turner is using it in 1840. At least one Van Gogh was not long ago discovered to actually be a fake because the viridian in it didn't have the right additional byproducts in it. So someone had found viridian, but it wasn't made by the right process. So it was a fake. So it was around, but it was kept secret. So think of all those people who would have been alive if they'd been manufacturing things with this instead, because this isn't toxic. But yes, 1863, when news gets out about how toxic the other stuff is, this becomes more popular. And yeah, Eugenie makes headlines wearing this, and everybody wants it. But it is a bit closer to turquoise. It's not quite your fresh green. And of course, the arsenic one is more affordable, because that's always how that works. It is annoyingly complicated because the word emerald can refer to different things. The French colour, emerald green, is viridian. The English colour, emerald green, is Paris green. So if you see something described as an emerald green dress at this time, you don't actually know which one it is. And also, of course, if one was advertised at the time, the people buying it wouldn't necessarily know which one it was. It's another reason for doing the test with the smelling salts, I guess. But in trade catalogues, if something's emerald green, it could go either way. Of course, there was a fight back from the manufacturers of the bright stuff, the toxic stuff. No one should put up with these dull alternatives. It is only the proper arsenic colours that give the bright enough shades. Dr. Thudicum, odd name, argues to the Society of Arts when painters are talking about different options. The only alternatives are abominable greys, hideous browns, and dreadful yellows. You can't get a proper green unless you're willing to use arsenic. And yeah, it does still get used after that point. There's a description of a lady who buys some green gloves at a respectable house in 1871 and finds her hands break out in blisters from the arsenic. It does gradually fade off after that point, as you would hope. People stop. You get the odd piece you can find in sort of the 1880s that's made with it, but the alternatives do start to become more popular. It's only taken one well-publicised hideous deaths and several, presumably large number of unpublicised ones to get there. It is, still being used in all sorts of other things, food colouring, paper for wrapping packages, paper for wrapping food. If you want, there are companies that have, if you go into the grocers, you'll wrap different types of food in different colours of paper. And one of them is bright green. And that is why you should never eat your vegetables. No, wait, that's not right. Soap in the 1860s. But yeah, blancmange, like I say, in 1860, a chef wanted to produce the most spectacular green blancmange ever, sent to a local supplier asking for some green dye. Yeah, you can imagine how well that went. There were 3 deaths, in fact. Candles with the bright green. I've even seen it suggested some miners were given arsenic green candles deliberately to discourage the miners from eating them. Which makes more sense than you think, because most candles given to a miner, of course, would be made of tallow, which is just animal fat, really. So if you're hungry enough, you could eat that. But if it's green, you won't. one hopes. The other big place we see arsenic as an issue is in wallpaper. And this is the other way it's getting into everybody's houses. They're putting it all over the walls. It's very cheap. It brightens the place up. As I say, if you're used to being in a place that has more green than your current surroundings, it is used as a household paint and used on wallpaper. This goes back to the early 19th century, when what we're talking about is Shields green again. So that is a genuine piece of the wallpaper which hung in Napoleon's exile house on St. Helena in 1821. And it is believed, I mean, he also did take a lot of antimony for medical complaints, so it wasn't just one cause that killed him, but it is believed that one of the things that killed off Napoleon was probably the arsenic in all of his wallpaper. We know about this. In 1980, there was a call out on the radio saying, there's this theory out there. Does anyone know for sure? Because there were lots of tourists who went there after he died, and perhaps some of them wrote down a diary description of the place. Does anyone know for sure what colour wallpaper Napoleon had? And somebody got in touch in 1980. They rang the radio station and said, yeah, not only can I tell you what colour it is, I can show you. I've got some scraps of it here in the family accounts, because it was a tourist thing in the early 19th century. When you went somewhere, you would take souvenirs. You'd take bits off chairs, bits off the walls, bits of whatever. This was considered perfectly normal. And at some point, one of this lady's ancestors had been to St. Helena soon after Napoleon's death, stripped sections off the walls and put them in a scrapbook. And this scrapbook had survived, so they were able to actually take this and study it. And there were a couple of other ones as well from different bits of the room, and all of them have small amounts of arsenic in. So he was completely surrounded by arsenic. Probably better for the lady to not be poring over that and breathing it in either. Now, wallpaper's quite unusual at that date. It really takes off in the mid 19th century. So in this country, there's about 1 million rolls being sold in 1830 and over 23 million by 1860. So it's increased dramatically, the amount of people who are going for wallpaper as a thing. And for a lot of them, Shields green is the colour of choice. It is very cheap. It is very fashionable. It brightens up your house. I've seen one estimate, I have no idea how they got to it, that by 1858, there were 100 million square miles of Shields green wallpaper in Britain. It's quite hard to get your head around that as a number, how many walls that must amount to. It's a big number. Here are a couple more pieces of it which are in better nick. That's the colour that you get, and that's why you would bother. You can actually buy a book now which is entirely comprised of reproduction, obviously not arsenic containing reproduction, all just of different green wallpapers that had arsenic in the first instance.
Dude, the 100 square miles of wallpaper, is that global, did you say, or just, where is that?
That's just Britain, apparently. I guess they've looked at the manufacturing statistics of all of the major production at the time and the different lines and so on to get it, but it does seem staggering, doesn't it? So yes, that's the sort of things you'd get. I mean, I don't think I'd want that all over my walls, regardless of whether it would poison me, but it's a little bit in your face, I think. But of course, there is a problem.
What year was that? I'm being dopey.
That's 1858.
1858.
Yeah, the 1860s is sort of 1858 is like the height of the first wave of wallpaper being fashionable.
Right.
But of course, there is a problem. It has green dust in it, and especially if the room is at all damp, the mold on the you get mold, and then the mold on the Shields Green chemical will start off gassing something really nasty. And yeah, people are dying not from the symptoms of arsenic as such, but from respiratory distress. The off-gassing of the mold allows a lot more of the arsenic to get out and into the room in gaseous form. In particular, it's also used for flock detail. And of course, if it's in flock, that means it's all the more powdery and will just flake off. Flakes from cheap paper. It's all going to be breathable in. It's also worse the hotter the room is. So if you try and light lots of fires to get rid of the damp, you've just made it worse. It's kind of a lose-lose situation going on. As early as 1839, again, somebody said, some chemists say, I think this is going to be an issue. But nobody really looks at it for another 18 years, when physician William Hines has papered his own room with Shields Green, and as a physician, he notes down all of his own symptoms and publicizes that he believes that this is being caused by his own wallpaper, and says a great deal of slow poisoning is going on in Britain. And yes, the Times again kicks up a bit of a fuss as part of the same 1860s panic about it. Panic seems the wrong word when it's completely justified. There you go. So the clothing industry cuts back after the 1860s, but the wallpaper industry, for some reason, is more resistant to change. They do have their own scandals. In 1862, a physician is called in by a couple who 3 of their children have died, and they are worried about the 4th. And earlier doctors had decided that these children had diphtheria, and the symptoms seemed vaguely consistent. But Orton noticed that none of the neighbours had it, which, if it was diphtheria, it's more likely to spread with the water. And he saw the green wallpaper and thought, perhaps it's something to do with that. He does an autopsy on one of the children, and it's discovered that the arsenic has killed her. The presiding judge did not like this. The presiding judge said that the findings of arsenic poisoning are objectionable, and directed the jury to say that it was a result of natural causes. Presumably he had some money or friends or Masonic chums or something in the industry to encourage that. Firms basically argued, as long as you don't eat the stuff or lick it, you'll be fine. It's in the walls. What's the problem? The Arsenic Act of 1868 was supposed to limit the amount that could be of arsenic that could be sold to individuals, but for industrial use, it's completely buyable on any scale you wanted, and that's all still going into consumer products. William Morris, he of the beautiful arts and crafts things, generally advocate of lots of natural dyes, traditional methods, don't sacrifice quality for cash, all hand done stuff. It's the last person you would expect to have been using anything made from nasty harsh chemicals. But recent tests have shown that a lot of his wallpaper does have arsenic in it. He thought that because no one in his house was ill from arsenic wallpaper, that can't possibly be the thing that's making people ill. He doesn't stop using it until he bows to public pressure on the issue. So there is a William Morris that definitely does contain arsenic in that green. And yes, in 1870 he begins to use alternative greens, and 5 years later he stops using it completely. He only stops using it completely because the manufacturers have stopped selling it, which really is not what I expected from William Morris. There you go. As late as 1885, he's challenged by a concerned customer, and he writes to the dye manufacturer, whinging about how these customers seem to care about things like this. He says, as to the arsenic scare, a greater folly it is hard possibly to imagine. The doctors were bitten as people were bitten by the witch fever. So just as people were seeing witches everywhere, doctors have started seeing arsenic everywhere, and it's all nonsense. Really not what I expected from William Morris. But there you go. He says he thought that if it was the case, more people would be ill. He thought if that was the problem, everyone would have it because of how common the wallpaper was. Of course, it does depend on the exact circumstances of the space you're in. It may be relevant to say that he did have part ownership in a copper mine, which also had a plant for the production of arsenic from the copper arsenide. Yeah, he apparently he never went there, but nonetheless, he's sort of slightly goes down in my estimation at this point. It's estimated that in 1860, 80% of English wallpaper had arsenic in it. So, if you ever time travel back to the 1860s, take a face mask. Because it's not just wallpaper, of course, it's your curtains and your carpets and your nighties, everything. Sometimes you would notice, because there was a bit of a sort of musty, garlicky smell, that's the gas coming off the walls. And people even thought that it was a good thing because, weirdly, if a bedroom has green wallpaper, especially if it has green bed sheets, nobody seems to get any bed bugs. How great is that? In 1871, arsenic production, despite being less popular in clothing, was Britain was the largest producer and the largest consumer, and that's across all the different things it's being used for. But it's just around. The next sort of turning point is 1879. A visiting dignitary to Buckingham Palace was placed in the green wallpapered guest chamber and fell ill. Queen Victoria, who must have been paying some attention to the news at this point, ordered that the paper be stripped entirely from the palace. We are having no green wallpaper in Buckingham Palace. And that hit the news. At the same time, people are advertising wallpapers as arsenic-free. So clearly news is getting around that it's better to avoid it. But of course, you can't just change your wallpaper on a whim. It's not cheap. People don't have that much money. If they've spent a lot of money putting up this stuff, they can't afford to just put up something new. People try painting it over, but of course that isn't necessarily going to do the job either. So it is definitely kind of hitting people's attention. In 1879, Henry Carr writes 2 books on behalf of the Royal College of Surgeons. One is called Our Domestic Poisons, or the Poison Effects of Certain Dyes and Colours Used in Domestic Fabrics. Full case studies from own experience and from asking other doctors to send them to me. And there's this whole list, and a whole load of doctors add their names to a list of, we think this stuff should be regulated more tightly. It's full of stories. A child in Peckham who died when he was sucking a piece of wallpaper in his nursery. Someone whose stockings irritated them. A case from Birmingham about a couple and their parrot, all of whom fell ill. So apparently it can affect parrots too, and all recovered when the paper was removed. Another anecdote at the time is of a member of Parliament who suffered, and it was because of his green socks. Again, socks are an issue. Several California miners wearing boots lined with green flannel to protect their feet during the hard day's work. Venetian blinds, chintz curtains, all these things. But it still has fans, Dr. McAdam read a paper condemning arsenic wallpaper and saying that firms should all be held to account. And he says, in the poisoning of the public mind lies the greater danger. Clearly, manufacturers wouldn't be trying to kill off their own customers. That would be stupid. Therefore, they aren't. Therefore, it's all nonsense. Which is impressive. and the paper has this it ends up in the Scotsman, and there's this big debate to and fro in the Scotsman, saying, one side saying, you can use other colours, other chemicals to get just as nice a range, and then the manufacturer replying, well, as long as you don't scrape it off or eat it, you'll be fine. And the last entry in this particular set of debates is, I've heard that some English firms announce they're prepared to guarantee their wallpapers free from arsenic, only provides proves this public scare is more prevalent in the South, as in we tough Scottish people don't need regulations like that. The English might have stopped doing it. He says, as I have just had my parlour repapered with green paper, Dr. McAdam will be at no loss to explain my silence in future. If I die, then he's right, but if I keep on talking, he's clearly not. And of course, we have the famous story, the yellow wallpaper. And this is 1892, and it's a kind of psychological horror short story about a woman who is given the rest cure, which is to say placed in extreme isolation in a single room and told to stay there and rest. And she basically goes gradually mad. And one of the things that's obsessing her is the sort of colour and pattern of this yellow wallpaper. Yellow-green can indeed be gained by arsenic, so that might drive you mad. And people have started using it to kill pests, as with the Paris green combination. So my last entry in the green category is going slightly off piste, but I really like it. Let me just find the link. There we go. People using this to kill pests, so it is very popular for this. So just as a last little bit on the uses of Paris green. During World War II, Disney released a set of videos trying to help farmers, and one of them is, several of them actually, are about explaining malaria to farmers and what they can do to prevent it, because I don't know why malaria has become a problem in America at this time, and recommends that you should use Paris green spray to kill flies and prevent people becoming ill from malaria. And the way they do that is using the 7 dwarfs. Let me just find the right place on the video. So they introduce you to the very, very strange combination of Dopey and Paris green.
Those are wigglers, Dopey. Give them the oil treatment. That'll kill them. Dusting with Paris green is an effective way of killing wigglers and is economical for covering large areas of water. A thin film of Paris green is strong enough to kill the wigglers without poisoning the fish. Mosquitoes must have water.
Isn't that marvelous and scary? No mention of giving any protection to the farmers while they're doing this, of course. And I'm really not sure it wouldn't harm the fish. Imagine the colour, though, this bright green right across the water. Yes, I ran across that and thought, there's something I never expected to see. Okay, so we will have a break there. I will make myself another hot drink.
Well, if you're killing off your readership, that's maybe not so good either.
So, secondly, we move on to the colour known as mummy brown, whereas arsenic green involves a lot of deaths at the time of it being used. Mummy brown involved a lot of deaths thousands of years before it was used. And the idea does go back a fair way, largely probably because it was widely thought from medieval times right onward that it contains bitumen. The very word, the Arabic word for bitumen is mumia. and that's how mummies got their name. So everyone thought that they had bitumen in them. Now, some of them do, but only a bit. It's not the best way of getting bitumen. Most of the times when you're looking at it and thinking it's bitumen, it's actually some sort of resin that they were using. And there's only a short period where you could find the real thing. The best place to find it would be in faked up modern mummies, which was another thing that happened in the 19th century. And of course, if something's got bitumen in, people might think it would work well as a pigment, and that's perhaps where this idea started. Mummies have been brought into this country and the rest of Europe for centuries as things to look at and also for medicinal purposes. A bit of ground up mummy in your tea. But it's not used much as a colour for most of that time. Sometimes, of course, we can't say. We know that powdered mummy is being imported and we assume it's being used as medicine, but who knows? And this, you can't even know by which shop it's going to, because, of course, it would be absolutely normal for the apothecary shop to be selling both medicine and paint anyway. The first mention we have of it being used as a colour is from 1584. It's suggested that that is by no means the first time that someone would have thought to try it. The first mention in England actually is in Othello, Shakespeare doing his thing. So Othello says, that handkerchief did an Egyptian to my mother give. She was a charmer and could almost read the thoughts of people. The worms were hallowed that did breed the silk, and it was dyed in mummy, which the skilful conserved of maidens' hearts. So it's not just from mummy, it's from mummified maiden heart. That lovely brown handkerchief comes. I thought brown was a best choice for a handkerchief anyway, but brown a silk handkerchief. Yeah.
Isn't that because of snuff?
What? So you don't see it?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose it's like.
Oh, I only saw it on QI, so it's probably rubbish.
Say again?
I saw it on QI. They said brown handkerchiefs were popular because otherwise it looked like poo. So they use brown hankies to posh people.
I don't know, but that does make sense, and certainly this is an example of a brown handkerchief. So yeah, quite probably. Yeah, I mean, you'd still be able to see the marks after a while, wouldn't you? But not straight away, like you would in a nice clean white one.
You could still get snuff brown hankies in the 1960s. I bought my dad one because we were newsagents and tobacconists, and we sold snuff. My dad sold snuff, so it was readily available, and that was definitely a thing.
It's going to come out very brown, so yeah, makes sense. So yeah, that's a use of it as a dye. More generally, we're talking paint than dye for mummy brown, though it doesn't make a terribly good dye. Because what you can do is mix it with white pitch, which is a resin from the Norway spruce, now confusingly called red pitch, and some sort of resin like myrrh, for instance, which will make a lovely rich brown paint known as mummy brown, or as caput mortuum, which is Latin for dead head. It looks a bit like, so this is a sort of paint sample selection from the time. So these are the colours you can get at the time. I've seen it suggested that it's somewhere between burnt umber and raw umber, which does obviously bring to mind the joke that it's perfectly well cooked umber, but it is its own thing. And yeah, as early as the 1700 or so, mummy brown is being mass produced. It was said at the time that one mummy can meet customer demands for 20 years. So you don't need that many of them, but it is an option. There's a cellar opens in Paris, basically just selling mummy products. It is called à la momie, of the mummy, and it sells paint, varnish, powder, incense. You can burn bits of mummy from an incense stick. Yeah, survived a few years. Wasn't a flop anyhow. And yeah, over the next 150 years, a lot of artists are using it. It is not the most pleasant stuff to make, as you can imagine. You have to first catch your mummy. A chemist called George Field records receiving a delivery of a mummy or several mummies for the purpose of making the pigment, and he writes, "It came as a mass containing and permeating rib bone, etc., of a smell strongly resembling garlic and ammonia, grinds easily, works rather pasty, unaffected by damp and foul air." Another source of that sort of time says that you have to wash it, cut it up, soak it for a few days, grind it, wash it again, filter it, dry it, pulverize it again, and then add the other things to make it into a paint. So, very, very, very fine ground, of course. Some people argued that you'd get slightly different colours from different bits of the mummy. They would rather have it from the thigh than, the brain. It was argued in the Compendium of Colours of 1797 that the fleshiest parts provide the best colour. 100 years later, a manual of pigment says, "I have drawn off the pure pigment from the muscle of mummies, therefore by producing an excellent light brown glaze colour called mumin." Not spelled like that. It's not actually made from mumins. The bones of the mummy also contain some pigment, but so little it's not worth the effort. Another dictionary of the time says you have to grind, if you grind the whole lot, you get a dirty coloured pigment, but if you just select the resinous bits, it's very useful. Other early 20th century sources say, oh no, it's better to use the whole thing. It has more solidity than just some bits alone would be. Another one says that the whole point of the colour is that it mixes the peculiar greyness due to the corpse and its bandages with the rich tone of the pitch or bitumen. So who knows? Another bigger issue really is that mummies are not all made the same. People made mummies over thousands of years, and they used different chemicals, different resins to do so. Some definitely have more bitumen in than others. So it was quite well known that it would be mixed in composition and quality, that some versions would be more likely to fade or to crack. And of course, if you go to one particular maker and it's a particular kind, then they're going to be using that same mummy for a while. So then you just have to go to a different shop and check out the quality of the mummy that they were using. But there were definite fans. There were people who said this can do things that other browns can't do. It's quite transparent, so you can use it for shading and glazing. It mixes well with oils and with watercolors. You could buy it as a sort of amber, to make an amber varnish over things. It was thought to, flow well, handle well. And I think some people did just like the idea that they were painting using mummy. There was something sort of romantic about that for some of the painters of the time.
What sort of person, what are they doing to find out that cutting up cloth from a dead person from Egypt is going to make a paint? What are you doing for that? What's going on?
I suspect that it was discovered while they were trying to make medicines. Because it was widely thought that there's some sort of innate property in bodies that have medical abilities for you. This is, the same era where crushed up skull from a recent person would be thought beneficial. So at some point they decided that mummies were medically beneficial, and at that point they'd be trying all manner of different ways to get it into you. And at some point somebody, mixed it with a resin and thought, oh, that makes a nice pretty brown smear on this piece of cloth, and then thought, oh, I'll improve on that. I don't know, but that's the medicine does generally come first. So, and also just they know that you can dye things with bitumen and they think it contains bitumen, so why not try it? But who perfected it? There are lots of books from the 18th and 19th century with instructions on how to make lots and lots of different pigments. Because it is quite a specialist skill. and there are shops that sell all the different pigments, like these ones, and like C. Roberson and something there, and actually I have an ancestor who may well have done this stuff because he worked in a color making capacity, and that would involve grinding up lots of different chemicals, and was the right era that he could just possibly have been grinding up some mummy, which is an interesting thought. So yeah, I think some of the more romantic end of the painters probably thought there was something quite interesting in using this colour. There were even people using it as a forgery for something else because it was actually cheaper to get hold of than umber, and also because it was slightly softer than umber, it might make the painting look a little bit older. So if you wanted to do an old brown painting, you'd use mummy brown, not straight umber on it. There is debate as to whether it's a worthwhile colour at all. You know, and it probably does depend which batch you get, but there are some people arguing that it's a really awful paint colour. Why are we bothering? You know, it stands neither air nor sunshine, dries with even more difficulty than asphaltum, is not better as a bitumen than the latter, just using bitumen, and is besides a fat body. And finally, that there is nothing in its hue which could not be obtained in certain other really good browns. It is not particularly prudent to employ without necessity these crumbled remains of dead bodies, which must contain ammonia and particles of fat in a concrete state, and more or less liable to injure the colours. It's therefore we ourselves have never yet felt the least desire to essay this pigment, seeing nothing to be gained by smearing our canvas with a part perhaps of the wife of Potiphar that might not as easily be secured by materials less frail and of a more sober character. So most of that is just, you know, practically it's not a good thing, with a slight note to the remember it's a person, but mostly not. Because, you know, there is an ethical side here. A lot of these tombs were ransacked. Mummies were split apart to take any trinkets that were wrapped in the bandages. People in the West justified all of this by saying that the Egyptians themselves have no respect for the mummies either. The Egyptians are wearing jewellery that they've picked up from the tombs. Some of them are living in tombs. They're you know, making shirts from old cloths and so on, which I'm sure was true to some extent, but they're probably doing it more because there's also a massive market in the West and North for these things. And yeah, they're also taken out for medicine, for display. Huge numbers of mummified animals are used as fertilizer in this era. At one point, they found something they described as a seam of mummified cats, which got spread across the north of England, leading to I think it was in the 1950s, somebody found a really unusual prehistoric tool, like prehistoric chipped flint, up in Scotland of a kind that had never been found there before, and a lot of very enthusiastic archaeologists went up to see why on earth this would be here, and then they discovered that it would have been spread on the field there as part of fertilizer, because it was actually an ancient Egyptian arrowhead. So yeah, there was a lot of that happened. So people were not too concerned about the ethics of it for the most part. Here are some pictures which either definitely are or are believed to have been made with mummy brown, to give you a sense of the colour at work. It's supposed to be very good at that kind of transparent shading effect that you see on this one, the kind of layers of shadow. And it's popular with the pre-Raphaelites particularly, but also other artists of the type. I mean, you see there, those are not all in the same genre of painting. We have the records of several artists to know that they did actually buy it. Edward Burne-Jones, Sir William Beechley, Eugene Delacroix, and so on. have their purchases documented. We don't know specifically, and I don't know why they haven't tested this in any of these cases, or they don't want to take any paint off the painting, I guess. Or maybe it's quite hard to be sure what the chemicals you're looking at come from, but there don't seem to be any paintings which anyone can say, yep, that definitely contains it. One of these, now which one is it? See if I can figure out which one it is. Hoffman. Yeah. So this one here on the right is thought to be a very, very good candidate for containing it. It's also been suggested, because of the era in which it was made, that yes, it's probably been made with powdered up body, but it could be the remains of French disinterred kings, because it's made during the Revolution, and they dug up a lot of French royalty who had been mummified, just in a different way, and obviously treated them in various sorts of disrespect. One little bit ended up getting eaten by William Buckland, so we're passing it around the table. So yes, all of the bits of a lot of the old French kings were spread to the masses to do with as they liked, pretty much. And yeah, one of the things that happened potentially was it got used for paint. This here is how do those two things connect? Apologies, too many tabs up at once. Yeah, that is supposed to be a painting. This one has very good credentials on the matter. So that is supposed to be a painting of a lady called Angelica Kaufmann, and she is also holding what may well be an urn of some description, bit of a hint, and all of those lovely warm browns. She's an interesting lady herself. She's one of the two women involved in founding the Royal Academy in 1768, and she's unusual because she mostly did history paintings, not portraiture. A poet called George Keat wrote an epistle to her, and it's a long poem, and in that he talks at length about the fact that she uses mummy brown, and it's quite marvelous. It's almost the main subject of the poem. He obviously thinks it's very romantic, and he says, among all the splendid glows of each bright colour that it shows, I see the pounded mummy laid, and mummy is in capital letters throughout, to give the soft transparent shade, warm the cold tints the dark ones raise, or all the finished picture glaze. Sweet paintress, mixed with these be laid the mummy, and still lend its aid, rich with the gums of ages past, 'twill bind each fleeting colour fast, make every shadow clearer show, and every light more brilliant glow. The pulverized Nitocris, which I assume is an famous Egyptian person of some description, the pulverized Nitocris now may grace some queen's majestic brow, then let Cephrenes' atoms live, the piece a darker shadow give. He's a bit weird, isn't he? So he's one of the ones who clearly does see it as quite romantic, that you might be painting with, ancient queens and using them to add extra luster to your artwork. But I think we can take a pretty strong hint from that Angelica Kaufmann did, in fact, use a lot of mummy brown. And if that painting is a painting of her holding an urn, then yeah, it's probably done that way as well. The other lovely anecdote from the time about this stuff, you'll have heard of the pre-Raphaelite Edward Burne-Jones. He had been using this brown for quite some time. When he was sitting having Sunday lunch with fellow painter, his friend Lawrence Alma-Tadema, and Alma-Tadema told him where mummy brown comes from. It's like telling a child where bacon comes from. Because Burne-Jones hadn't known. He'd thought it was just a descriptive name for this is the colour of a mummy. Alma-Tadema was doing this little anecdote about how, I wanted to see the mummy that it came from first, so I asked my colour man to fetch the mummy out to make sure it was a good one. And Burne-Jones was like, You did what now? He was absolutely horrified. And Burne-Jones went to fetch his only tube of Mummy Brown. And we have a description from his widow, Georgina, who wrote a biography of him. Was remembered by all of us as the day of the funeral of a tube of mummy paint. We were sitting together after lunch, the men talking about different colours they had used, when Mr. Taddimer startled us by saying he'd lately been invited to go and see a mummy that was part of his colourman's workshop before it was ground down. Edward scouted, which apparently means rejected forcefully, the idea of the pigment having anything to do with a mummy, said the name must only be borrowed to describe a particular shade. But when assured that it was actually compounded of real mummy, he left us at once, hastened to the studio, and returning with the only tube he had, insisted that we gave it a decent burial then and there. So a hole was bored in the green grass at our feet, and we all watched it put in safely, and the spot was marked by one of the girls planting a daisy root above it. One Sunday afternoon. It's such an image. There is another witness to this who is extremely last person you'd think. Georgina Burne-Jones, his wife, is the aunt of Rudyard Kipling. And Kipling was there at this sort of family dinner. And he later wrote, Burne-Jones descended in broad daylight with a tube of Mummy Brown in his hand, saying he had discovered it was made of dead pharaohs and we must bury it accordingly. So we all went out and helped, according to the rites of Mizraim and Memphis, I hope. And to this day I could drive a spade within a foot of where that tube lies. Which, really random bringing in of Kipling there. This one goes out with more of a whimper than a bang. There isn't a great scandal about it because everybody's known all along what it's made from. They just haven't minded so much. People start gradually caring at about the turn of the century. The last sort of big public unwrapping is in the 1910s, I believe. In 1904, one colour firm actually advertised in the Daily Mail for a mummy. It was getting harder to get hold of them. I think international politics and customs had made it much harder. And yeah, there's an advert in the Mail saying we are badly in want of one at a suitable price, but find considerable difficulty obtaining it. It may appear strange to you, but we require our mummy for making colour. Surely a 2,000-year-old mummy of an Egyptian monarch may be used for adorning a noble fresco in Westminster Hall or elsewhere without giving offence to the ghost of the departed gentleman or his descendants. So that suggests that people are starting to think maybe this is disrespectful, and that's why it's getting harder to get hold of the colour. So yeah, public distaste leads to a crash in the use of it in the early 20th century. Robeson of London, the ones that tube in the picture, see Robeson of London, are still selling it until roughly the war, in very small quantities. We have their stock taking records from 1913. And within that records it says mummy 1 box as 1912. They've got some, but they haven't sold it. Sometimes people started trying to sell it as Egyptian brown because then you might not know where it came from. People start making substitute colours that you can use, which are identical, they would say. You can buy sham mummy or mummyine, ending Y-I-N-E, which is advertised as an extract obtained by solvents, without ever saying what it's been extracted from. So it could still be mummies for all I know. But yeah, mummyine. It's an extract. That's all you need to know, right? As the managing director of Robeson, he was interviewed by Time magazine in 1964, and he said, "Oh, we might have a few odd limbs lying around somewhere, but not enough to make any more paint," which is incredibly blasé. And now all you can do is buy something called bauxite mummy, which is supposed to sort of replicate the colour, but contains no actual mummy at all. Which is probably for the best, although, given a choice between mummy brown and arsenic green, I think I'd still paint my walls brown. It's not actively harmful to the people involved, only to Memory of those long gone. So yeah, that's arsenic brown and mummy green. As I say, I will be back next week for your bemusement with some other colour stories, because might be more kind of little snippets of half a dozen different colours, because there are loads of weird stories behind a lot of different colours, whether in the making of them or the reception of them, or the name of them. Sometimes some of them, the names are just hilarious. In the early, some of the early modern ones. Goose turd green stockings, anyone? that wasn't.
Joe, there are many words for colours between red and blue, which shades I would like very much. I'm wondering now if I should look at the etymology of all those words like violet and purple and so on.
A lot of them do come from plants, as you'd expect.
Okay.
Lilac. But yeah, there are some weird ones. I mean, your Tyrian purple is because the snail shell is from Tyre, and
is imperial purple Tyrian purple? I thought it might be. Thank you, Joe.
And we'll look at Movine dyes probably next time. So yeah, it's color names for colors seem to either come from it is describing a thing like violet. It goes back to Proto-Indo-European, which then it gets really weird because there are colors which have descendants that mean yellow and mean blue. And exactly how that happens is very, very complicated and I think not entirely understood. Or they are bonkers. I'll give you just one. Isabelline is a sort of shade of creamy brown fawn color. Nobody knows why it's actually called that, but the story is that one particular noble, Isabel, sent her man off to the Crusades and said she wouldn't change her white linens until he came back. And he came back like 5 years later. And then her linens were Isabelline in colour.
Gosh.
Now, it can't sadly be true about the person that it's usually told about, because the colour description is given a few years before that incident with the Crusader actually happened, but it's then been attached to other Isabels. So we don't know, but the nature of that colour is that it's come to be associated with, what colour your linens go if you don't take them off for years.
Oh, Joe, another little light bulb's gone off on me in my head, as it does when I meet you. Is there an ancient controversy about what colour the Greeks saw the sea as?
Oh, yes. They
Can you solve that for me?
Well, they don't have a word for blue. And this is actually quite normal for early cultures. It is usually the last colour which gets a name in a society. Cultures will start off by saying light and dark, and then they will kind of divide other colours between that. Then they'll usually come up with red, and then they'll come up with green or yellow, or a colour that means both. And they gradually move towards tertiary colours. So in England, for instance, the last colours to come in of the kind of major colour groups are orange and pink, which are both only come into the country in the 17th century. And if you can't call it pink or can't call it orange, you have to call it red, which is why Olga's a redhead and there's a robin redbreast out there. Similarly, the Greeks have not yet got their colour for blue. The Welsh didn't have a colour for blue until after written record as well. There were some strange phrases turn up in Welsh. So instead of calling it that, they have to call it by something else. And at that point, the word, exactly what is meant by each colour, tends to be a bit more abstract than our meaning for colour. We can say, okay, between that light, what's the word I'm looking for? That wavelength and that wavelength, that colour is green. And it gets a bit fuzzy at the edges, but basically that's green. For them, it has a lot more properties involved. It can be more to do with how bright and shiny it is, for instance. So things can be called yellow when they're not actually yellow, they're just shiny. The definitions are a bit more abstract, and that is why, yes, Homer gives us a wine dark sea and a bronze sky, and we think bronze is the last thing the sky is, but it's shiny. You can't stare at it for too long.
I understand experiments on animals have shown that they see colours outside our range.
Quite a lot do, yes.
I look forward to those
Into the
colours
ultraviolet.
that we'll never see being given names, don't you?
Well, Olga, can you see more into the ultraviolet than you could? Because that's a thing, isn't it?
Yes, I can.
Yeah.
When there's a rainbow, I can see further into the blue with my left eye than my right.
Yes, and having one, because which bit of it that makes the difference?
It's the lens.
When
Oh,
you've got
wow.
when you've got it. So what property of the lens is? I can't remember.
Well, the natural lens blocks more UV. The artificial lens still blocks far UV, but I've always been fairly sensitive to UV anyway. I can't stay in a nightclub where they've got UV lights for long, whatever. But I can see further into the blue with my artificial lens than my natural one.
That is as close as we can ever get to properly seeing into the ultraviolet.
Yes.
Yeah.
Gosh, so
I have
Olga,
the
I'm
other
waiting.
end to that.
I do apologise. Sorry.
That's all right.
Please
No,
go ahead.
I have the other end to that. I see more into the infrared than most, because I can, it's where night sight lives, being able to see the texture of the ground.
Oh, well, I'm looking forward to you two coming back with an extended version of Richard of York Gave Battle in Vain.
Well, there's also the one that a lot of animal groups don't have as many color receptors as we do. So,
Yeah.
for instance, one of the reasons tigers work really well with their orange black is because most animals that they hunt can't see the difference between orange and green.
Yeah. So it's
Wow.
Only by hue and not by color.
Yeah.
And Richard of York Gave Battle in Vain, of course, you know that's completely Newton invented colours to make the rainbow work.
No, I didn't.
If you
I
ever
rely on you for that, Joe.
If you ever looked at an actual rainbow, you'd be thinking, okay, where are the dividing lines? I can definitely see some yellow and I can see some green, but I'm not sure I can see 7 different colours there. That's because there aren't really, in terms of way that, well, I'd say it's all labelling, it's all how do we process these things anyway, but for an average Western brain, what you are looking at when you look at a true rainbow is not 7 colours. And that happened because Newton, when he was doing all of his work with prisms, thought that 7 was a mystical, holy, important number, and therefore, of course, it was going to divide into 7.
Of course, most of his writings were about mystical
Yeah.
and alchemical subjects, weren't they?
So he kind of invented indigo.
How wonderful. So he started the social construction of discrete colours.
I mean, there were names for things before, but yes, he's certainly part of that process.
Yes, gosh.
Yeah, he invented indigo. Obviously, the colour exists as a colour, but it isn't part of the spectrum as a discrete section. But he had to make it one to make his mystical theories of the rainbow work.
Great.
So yes, more of that sort of thing next week, when I figure out what I'm going to talk about.
There's a thunderstorm predicted for Friday around here, so I shall be out with my umbrella.
Looking out for lightning strikes.
And, well, the subsequent rainbows that often follow heavy storms.
Good luck with that.
Thank